the darkness parted to reveal a chilling sight. SS Sturmbannführer Heinrich Müller peered through his field glasses at the horizon, where the first American Sherman tanks were appearing through the morning mist. His hands trembled slightly, betraying the confidence he had projected to his men just hours before. "Impossible," he whispered. "The Americans weren't supposed to be here. Not yet. Not with such overwhelming force." Müller lowered the binoculars, the weight of realization settling on him. His carefully fortified urban stronghold, the medieval German town of Aachen that Hitler had ordered held to the last man, was about to face America's industrial might. As dawn fully broke on October 13, 1944, Müller understood a terrifying truth. His Führer's vaunted fortress city strategy was about to be tested against the unstoppable rolling thunder of American armor. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. The Battle of Aachen in October 1944 represented a pivotal moment in the Allied advance into Nazi Germany. As the first major German city to face the American onslaught, its significance extended far beyond tactical considerations. This ancient imperial city, once the capital of Charlemagne's vast empire, had been declared by Hitler to be the western gateway to the Reich, a symbolic fortress that must never fall. For the Americans, it represented the first test of urban warfare on German soil, a psychological barrier that needed to be broken. The city itself seemed designed for defense. Founded by the Romans nearly 2 millennia earlier because of its natural protective terrain, Aachen sat nestled in a basin surrounded by hills. Medieval walls, though mostly demolished over the centuries, had been supplemented by modern fortifications. The narrow, winding streets of the Old Town Center created natural choke points, and the ancient buildings with their thick stone walls made perfect defensive positions. The Germans had spent months transforming this historic city into a death trap for any invading force. By October 1944, the Allied momentum following the D-Day landings had begun to slow. After the breakout from Normandy and the rapid advance across France, Allied forces faced increasingly stiff resistance as they approached German territory. Supply lines were stretched thin, and the euphoria of liberation was giving way to the grim reality of fighting an enemy defending their homeland. The Nazi propaganda machine had been working overtime, telling German civilians that American troops would rape, pillage, and destroy their culture. For soldiers like Heinrich Müller, retreat was no longer an option, not just militarily, but ideologically. Müller was not a typical SS officer. At 39, he was older than many of his counterparts, having joined the Nazi Party in its early days. Unlike many fanatical SS commanders, he had received formal military education and served briefly in the regular German army before transferring to the Waffen-SS. His tactical acumen had earned him command of the defense of the southern section of Aachen, where he oversaw a mixed force of Wehrmacht soldiers, Volkssturm, civilian militia, and a corps of hardened SS troops. Despite private doubts about final victory, Müller maintained the facade of Nazi confidence, knowing that hesitation meant death, either from the approaching Americans or from his own superiors. Across the battlefield, Colonel John Corley of the 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red One, was preparing his men for what they knew would be a bloody fight. At 30, Corley had already seen more combat than most career officers, having led troops in North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy. His 26th Infantry Regiment had been tasked with the northern assault on Aachen, while the 16th Infantry Regiment would attack from the south. "This isn't like anything we've faced before," Corley told his company commanders during their final briefing on October 12th. "We're not liberating these people. They're Germans. Some will fight, some won't. But this is their home, and they've been told we're monsters. Every building is a potential fortress, every civilian a potential enemy. He paused, looking at the tired faces around him. But we have something they don't: Sherman tanks and a hell of a lot of artillery. The American plan was deceptively straightforward: encircle the city, cut it off from reinforcement, then squeeze it from north and south. The 30th Infantry Division would hold the northern edge of the encirclement, while the 1st Division would execute the main assault. But military plans rarely survive contact with the enemy, and both sides knew that urban combat was among the most unpredictable and costly forms of warfare. Before the ground assault began, the Americans unleashed the awesome power of their artillery. For nearly a week, howitzers had been pounding the city's defenses, focusing on known strong points identified by aerial reconnaissance. The psychological impact on the defenders was devastating. The constant barrage, day and night, prevented sleep and slowly eroded morale. One German defender later wrote in his diary, "The Americans don't attack. They simply remove the city from the earth and then move forward." The artillery preparation reached its crescendo on the morning of October 13th. Over 300 guns concentrated their fire on Aachen, delivering more than 5,000 shells in just a few hours. The city, already damaged by previous Allied air raids, began to take on the appearance of a lunar landscape. Historic buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble, creating both obstacles for the attacking Americans and new defensive positions for the Germans. For Muller, watching from his command post in a reinforced cellar beneath a former administrative building, the American bombardment was both terrifying and oddly reassuring. The very intensity of the barrage confirmed his belief that the Americans respected the German defenses enough to try to obliterate them before risking their infantry. But it also meant that when the tanks and troops finally came, they would come in overwhelming numbers. The Americans had assembled a formidable armored force for the Aachen operation. The backbone was the M4 Sherman medium tank, not the best tank of the war by technical standards, but available in numbers that the Germans could only dream of. By October 1944, many of these Shermans had been upgraded with the more powerful 76mm gun, giving them a better chance against German armor. They were supported by tank destroyers, fast, lightly armored vehicles mounting powerful anti-tank guns, and specialized engineering vehicles like the M32 tank recovery vehicle and the Sherman Crab flail tank for clearing mines. What made the Sherman truly effective, however, wasn't its individual capabilities, but how the Americans employed them. Unlike the Germans, who often saw tanks as individual fighting platforms, the Americans used them as part of combined arms teams. Each Sherman worked closely with infantry squads who protected the tanks from enemy soldiers with anti-tank weapons, while the tanks provided the heavy firepower the infantry needed to overcome strong points. This synergy would prove decisive in the narrow streets of Aachen, where tanks operating alone would be vulnerable to ambush from all sides. The Americans had also learned bitter lessons about urban fighting in Italy, particularly at Ortona, which had been dubbed Little Stalingrad for its ferocity. They knew that taking Aachen would require methodical, block-by-block clearing operations, with each building needing to be secured before the advance could continue. As dawn broke on October 13th, the artillery barrage lifted, and an eerie silence fell over the shattered city. Then came the distinctive rumble of Sherman tank engines, a sound that experienced German soldiers had learned to fear. The first tanks appeared through the smoke and dust, advancing cautiously, with infantry squads spread out around them. The battle for Aachen had begun in earnest. Muller's men opened fire from carefully prepared positions. Machine guns swept the streets, forcing American infantry to hug walls and dive for cover. Anti-tank teams waited until Shermans passed, before emerging from hiding to attack their vulnerable rear armor with Panzerfausts, single-shot, shoulder-fired rockets that could penetrate a Sherman's relatively thin side and rear armor. The first day of fighting set the pattern for what would follow, a grinding house-by-house battle where progress was measured in yards, not miles. The Americans would secure a building only to be fired upon from the next. They would clear a street only to find the Germans had infiltrated back into buildings behind them. Snipers made any movement in open areas potentially fatal, and booby traps left in abandoned positions caused casualties even when the enemy wasn't present. For the tank crews, the urban environment was particularly challenging. The Sherman's design, with its high profile and relatively thin armor, made it vulnerable in city fighting. German soldiers quickly learned to fire from upper floors, targeting the tank's thinner top armor. The tank's main guns, designed for direct fire at other vehicles, struggled to elevate high enough to hit enemies in tall buildings, and the narrow streets limited their mobility, often forcing them to advance in single file where they couldn't bring their full firepower to bear. By nightfall on October 13th, American forces had penetrated only a few blocks into the city from both the north and south. The cost had been high, several tanks knocked out, and dozens of casualties among the infantry. But the Americans had established a foothold, and their superior resources meant they could replace losses much more quickly than the Germans. As darkness fell, Müller gathered his company commanders in his underground headquarters. The flickering light of emergency lamps cast long shadows across the concrete walls covered with maps. The faces of his officers told the story before they spoke: exhaustion, fear, and grim determination. "We've held them for now," Müller said, his voice steady despite his own fatigue. "But they'll keep coming. More tanks, more men, more artillery. We need to make them pay for every inch." One of his company commanders, a veteran of the Eastern Front, spoke up. "Sir, this isn't Russia. We don't have the depth or the numbers. The Americans aren't like the Russians. They don't waste their men in frontal assaults. They use their tanks and artillery to blast through, then send in the infantry to mop up." Müller nodded. "Which is why we need to separate them. Draw their infantry into areas where their tanks can't follow. Use the sewers and cellars to move behind them. Don't try to stop their tanks, just their infantry. Without infantry, their tanks are blind in this environment." The strategy was sound, but Müller harbored no illusions about the eventual outcome. His orders were to hold the city at all costs, but he had received word that the promised reinforcements from the 116th Panzer Division were being held up by Allied air attacks. Without those reinforcements, it was only a matter of time before American numerical superiority would prevail. What Müller didn't know was that the Americans were also reassessing their approach. Colonel Corley had been surprised by the ferocity of the German resistance. He had expected the largely civilian Volkssturm units to surrender quickly, leaving only the SS and Wehrmacht regulars to deal with. Instead, the civilian militia was fighting with unexpected determination, suggesting that Nazi propaganda about American atrocities had been effective. Corley met with his battalion commanders in an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city that night. "We need to change our approach," he told them. "We're taking too many casualties trying to advance on a broad front. Starting tomorrow, we concentrate our tanks and artillery on creating corridors, punch through their lines at selected points, then expand outward." The new tactics would be implemented the following morning, but the night still belonged to smaller infiltration actions. American combat engineers moved forward under cover of darkness to clear obstacles and prepare routes for the next day's tank advances. German patrols probed American positions, seeking weaknesses. Occasionally, brief, violent firefights erupted in the darkness, muzzle flashes illuminating the ruins like lightning. For the civilians caught in this nightmare, the night of October 13th was perhaps the worst so far. Most of Aachen's population of around 160,000 had been evacuated before the battle, but approximately 20,000 civilians remained, many too old or infirm to leave. They huddled in cellars and makeshift bomb shelters, terrified of both the American bombardment and the Nazi troops who had threatened to execute anyone showing signs of surrendering or displaying white flags. One such civilian was Maria Schmidt, a 68-year-old widow who had refused to leave her family home near the center of Aachen. "I have lived through the Kaiser's War," she reportedly told neighbors who urged her to evacuate. I will survive this one too. Now, as artillery shells whistled overhead and the crash of collapsing buildings punctuated the night, she questioned her decision. In her diary, recovered after the battle, she wrote, "The Americans are in the city now. The radio told us they would kill us all, but Frau Weber spoke with an American soldier today. She says they gave her chocolate. I don't know what to believe anymore. I just want the shooting to stop." The morning of October 14th brought renewed American pressure. Following Corley's new strategy, the Americans concentrated their armor and artillery on selected thrust points rather than advancing across a broad front. The effect was dramatic. Wherever the Sherman tanks concentrated, they overwhelmed the German defenses through sheer firepower. One such thrust targeted Muller's sector in the southern part of the city. Shortly after dawn, more than 20 Sherman tanks, supported by tank destroyers and accompanied by infantry from the 16th Regiment, began a coordinated attack down Wilhelmstrasse, one of the few streets wide enough for multiple tanks to advance abreast. Muller had anticipated an American push in this sector and had prepared accordingly. Anti-tank teams were positioned in buildings overlooking the street with interlocking fields of fire. Panzerfausts were distributed liberally, along with the newer and more powerful Panzerschreck, a German copy of the American bazooka. Several streets were barricaded with rubble and booby-trapped, channeling the American tanks into killing zones. When the American armor appeared through the morning mist, the German defenders held their fire, waiting until the lead elements had passed the first prepared positions. Then, on Muller's command, they struck. Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks fired simultaneously from multiple positions, while machine guns opened up on the accompanying infantry. The lead Sherman erupted in flames as a Panzerfaust round penetrated its side armor. The tank behind it was hit in the tracks and ground to a halt, blocking the narrow street. For a moment, it seemed Muller's trap had worked perfectly, but the Americans reacted with the speed and flexibility that came from hard-won experience. The remaining tanks reversed direction while laying down covering fire. Infantry squads rapidly deployed into buildings on either side of the street, working their way forward room by room to clear out the German anti-tank positions. Meanwhile, American artillery observers called in precise strikes on identified German strongpoints. Within an hour, the momentum had shifted. The Americans had overcome the initial ambush and were methodically neutralizing the defensive positions Muller had established. By mid-morning, they had secured several key buildings that overlooked the street, allowing their advance to resume. This pattern repeated across the city throughout the day. The Germans would ambush American tanks in narrow streets, achieve initial success, but then be overwhelmed by coordinated infantry armor counterattacks, supported by devastating artillery fire. The American ability to quickly adapt to the urban environment was proving decisive. By the evening of October 14th, American forces had made significant progress from both the north and south, threatening to split the German defense into isolated pockets. Muller received reports that the northern American force under Colonel Corley had reached the central market square and was threatening to cut off his sector from the rest of the German defenders. As night fell, Muller made a difficult decision. Against his orders to hold in place, he ordered a tactical withdrawal to a more defensible line centered around the ancient cathedral. This would consolidate his increasingly scattered forces and, he hoped, allow them to hold out until the promised reinforcements arrived. The withdrawal was conducted under cover of darkness, with rear guards left behind to slow the American advance. It was during this withdrawal that one of the most remarkable episodes of the battle occurred, an event that would later be celebrated in American accounts, but barely mentioned in German records. A lone Sherman tank, separated from its unit during the day's fighting, found itself deep in German-held territory as darkness fell. The tank commander, Sergeant Frank Moyer, opted to hide rather than attempt to return to American lines. He positioned his Sherman in the rubble-filled courtyard of a bombed-out school and ordered his crew to maintain absolute silence. Throughout the night, German troops moved past the hidden tank, withdrawing to their new positions. Moyer and his crew could hear German voices just feet away from their position, but maintained their discipline and did not fire. At dawn, they found themselves behind the new German defensive line, with an unprecedented opportunity. Starting their engine, they emerged from hiding and attacked the German positions from the rear. The psychological impact was devastating. German troops, believing they faced a major American breakthrough, began to abandon their carefully prepared positions. In the confusion, American forces advancing from the opposite direction were able to secure several key buildings with minimal resistance. Moyer's Sherman, later nicknamed Ghost by the grateful infantry, was credited with single-handedly collapsing a significant portion of the German line. For Müller, it was yet another sign that the battle was turning against him. The Americans seemed to be everywhere at once, their tanks appearing in places where they should not have been able to reach. The third day of battle, October 15th, brought a new complication for the German defenders. American forces had completed the encirclement of the city, cutting off any possibility of reinforcement. The promised elements of the 116th Panzer Division had been unable to break through the American cordon, leaving Müller and the other defenders to fight on alone. The psychological impact of this news spread quickly through the German ranks. For many of the Volkssturm militiamen, the prospect of fighting without hope of relief was too much to bear. Desertion rates soared, with many civilian fighters discarding their armbands and weapons and trying to blend back into the remaining civilian population. Müller faced a critical shortage of manpower just as the American pressure was intensifying. He was forced to consolidate further, abandoning outer positions to strengthen the defense of the city center. This created a dense defensive zone around the cathedral and historic town hall, but it also meant surrendering initiative entirely to the Americans, who could now move freely through much of the city. The Americans recognized the opportunity and accelerated their advance. Sherman tanks, now operating with greater confidence in the urban environment, pushed forward aggressively. They developed new tactics on the fly, using their main guns to blast holes through building walls, allowing infantry to advance without exposing themselves in the streets. Tank dozer variants cleared rubble barricades, while specialized flamethrower tanks dealt with particularly stubborn strongpoints. By midday on October 15th, American forces from the north and south had linked up, effectively cutting the German defense in half. Müller's southern group was now isolated from the northern defenders, making coordinated action impossible. Communication relied on runners moving through sewers and cellars, many of whom never reached their destinations. That afternoon, in a desperate attempt to regain some initiative, Müller organized a counterattack using his remaining SS troops and the few operational armored vehicles at his disposal, primarily Stugge 3 assault guns, turretless armored vehicles mounting a powerful 75mm gun. The counterattack initially caught the Americans by surprise, recapturing several buildings and briefly threatening to cut off an American spearhead. But the German success was short-lived. American artillery, guided by forward observers with radio contact to the gun batteries outside the city, quickly zeroed in on the German assault. Meanwhile, P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers appeared overhead, their 500-pound bombs and 50-caliber machine guns wreaking havoc on exposed German positions. By nightfall, the counterattack had been contained and pushed back, with heavy German losses. Müller had gambled his best remaining troops and lost. With them went any realistic hope of prolonging the defense significantly. The night of October 15th-16th was marked by an increasing sense of doom among the German defenders. Ammunition was running low, casualties could not be properly evacuated or treated, and it was becoming clear to even the most dedicated Nazi supporters that the battle was lost. For Müller, the situation presented an excruciating dilemma. His orders were explicit: hold to the last man. Surrender was not an option. It would mean not only personal dishonor, but potentially reprisals against his family back in Germany. Yet continuing the fight meant condemning his remaining men to almost certain death. with no strategic purpose now that the city was effectively lost. In his command bunker, Muller studied the situation maps by lamplight. American forces had penetrated to within 2 blocks of his position. By morning, they would likely be at his door. His communications with other German units had become sporadic, suggesting that organized resistance was collapsing across the city. A knock at the bunker door interrupted his thoughts. One of his few remaining company commanders entered, his uniform dust-covered and torn. "Herr Sturmbannführer, the Americans have broken through to the Cathedral Square. Our western perimeter is overrun. We have perhaps 50 combat-effective men left." Muller nodded slowly. "And ammunition?" "Less than a day's worth if the fighting remains at current intensity. No anti-tank rounds at all." Muller turned back to his map, tracing a finger along the few streets his forces still controlled. "We will consolidate everything at the town hall. It's our most defensible remaining position. Pull everyone back there before dawn." The officer hesitated. "Sir, some of the men are talking about surrender, the Volkssturm especially. They've heard the Americans are treating prisoners correctly." Muller's expression hardened. "Our orders are clear. Anyone attempting to surrender will be dealt with according to the Führer's directive." But even as he spoke the words, a part of him wondered if he would actually enforce such an order now, with defeat inevitable. As his subordinate left to organize the withdrawal, Muller sat alone in the dimly lit bunker. On the wall hung a portrait of Hitler, now askew from the concussion of nearby artillery impacts. Muller straightened it automatically, then paused, his hand still on the frame. For years he had served the Nazi regime with conviction, believing in the rebirth of German greatness. Now, in the collapsing ruins of Aachen, that belief seemed as hollow as the bombed-out buildings above him. Outside, the rumble of Sherman tanks could be heard growing closer. The morning of October 16th dawned cold and foggy, the weather matching the grim mood of the remaining German defenders. Muller had managed to assemble about 200 fighters at the town hall, a mixed force of SS, Wehrmacht, and the more reliable Volkssturm units. They had barricaded the entrances, set up machine gun nests covering the approaches, and prepared the building for a last stand. The civilian population, caught in this final pocket of resistance, huddled in the building's cellar. Among them was Maria Schmidt, the elderly woman who had refused evacuation. In her diary she wrote, "The soldiers came in the night, telling us to move to the Rathaus town hall. They said it would be safer, but I think they are using us as shields. There are children here, crying for food. The soldiers give us nothing." As the fog began to lift, the Americans prepared for what they hoped would be the final push to secure the city. Colonel Corley had brought up additional resources for the assault on the town hall, including several Sherman tanks equipped with dozer blades to clear obstacles and specialized demolition teams to breach the historic building if necessary. Before launching the attack, however, Corley authorized one final attempt to avoid further bloodshed. Using a German civilian as an interpreter, the Americans broadcast a surrender demand via loudspeaker, offering honorable treatment to all who laid down their weapons. The message specifically addressed the Volkssturm members, noting that as conscripted civilians rather than regular military, they could expect to be processed and released quickly. Inside the town hall, the surrender broadcast triggered heated arguments among the defenders. Many of the Volkssturm members and some Wehrmacht soldiers wanted to accept the terms, seeing no point in further resistance. The SS men, however, remained committed to fighting to the end, both from ideological conviction and fear of Allied treatment of SS prisoners. Muller, listening to the broadcast from a second-floor window, faced the culmination of his personal crisis. The battle was lost. The city was lost. Perhaps the war itself was lost. Did it make sense to sacrifice the lives of everyone in the building for a cause that was already defeated? As the American deadline for response approached, Muller made his decision. He gathered his officers and issued new orders. The Volkssturm and any Wehrmacht soldiers who wished to surrender would be allowed to do so. The SS men who wanted to continue fighting could attempt to break out of the American encirclement that night. He himself would stay with those who fought on. At 10 a.m., a white flag appeared from one of the town hall windows. Shortly after, approximately 120 German fighters, mostly Volkssturm with some Wehrmacht, began filing out with their hands raised. American infantry approached cautiously, wary of a trap, but the surrender was genuine. The prisoners were disarmed and moved to the rear, where they would be processed and eventually transported to POW camps. Müller watched the surrender from his position, feeling a complex mixture of emotions: contempt for those laying down arms, envy of their moral freedom to do so, and a growing sense that he was witnessing the end not just of a battle, but of the world he had believed in. With the surrender of the majority of the defenders, the Americans prepared to clear the town hall of the remaining resistance. Sherman tanks moved into position, their main guns trained on the historic building. Infantry teams spread out, covering all possible exits. Inside, Müller gathered the 30 or so SS men who had chosen to stay and fight. "We break out tonight, moving in small groups through the sewers," he told them. "The Americans will be focused on securing the city center. If we can reach the eastern outskirts, there's a chance of linking up with friendly forces." But as he spoke, the first American shells struck the town hall. The ancient building, despite its thick stone walls, shook from the impact. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the distinctive sound of tank engines grew louder as the Shermans closed in. For the civilians in the cellar, including Maria Schmidt, the barrage was terrifying. "The whole building is shaking," she wrote. "The children are screaming. Some of the soldiers are still here, but they are arguing among themselves. I think the end is coming." The American attack on the town hall proceeded methodically. Rather than a frontal assault that would endanger the civilians inside, they began a systematic reduction of the building's defenses. Tanks fired at specific strong points identified by reconnaissance. Combat engineers approached under covering fire to place demolition charges at key structural points. The goal was not to destroy the historic building, but to make it indefensible, forcing the remaining SS men to surrender or attempt their breakout prematurely. As night approached on October 16th, Müller realized that waiting until darkness for the planned breakout was no longer viable. The Americans were tightening their cordon around the town hall, and parts of the building were already on fire from tank and artillery hits. In a final briefing to his men, Müller outlined a desperate plan. They would use the remaining civilians as cover for their escape attempt, threatening to kill them if the Americans fired upon the group. It was a violation of the laws of warfare. But Müller had moved beyond such considerations. Survival was all that mattered now. But when SS troops entered the cellar to gather the civilians, they found it empty. During the confusion of the American bombardment, someone had discovered a passage to an adjacent building, and the civilians had fled. Among them was Maria Schmidt, who wrote her final diary entry that evening from the safety of American lines. "We are free now. The American soldiers gave us food and blankets. They are not monsters as we were told. The real monsters wore our own uniforms." Deprived of their human shields and with the town hall becoming increasingly untenable, Müller's remaining SS men attempted a breakout anyway. In small groups, they rushed from the building, firing wildly at American positions in hopes of creating enough confusion to slip through the cordon. Few made it more than 100 yards. American infantry, well-positioned and expecting such a move, cut down most of the escapees with concentrated rifle and machine gun fire. Those who surrendered were taken prisoner, though some were reportedly shot while attempting to escape, a reflection of the American troops' particular hatred for the SS. Müller himself was among the last to leave the burning town hall. Armed with only a pistol, he made it to a partially collapsed building across the square before American fire forced him to take cover. As Sherman tanks approached his position, their headlights cutting through the evening gloom, and main guns trained on his hiding place, Müller faced the final collapse of his world. What happened next remained somewhat unclear in the historical record. According to some accounts, Müller emerged with his hands raised, surrendering to American troops. Other reports suggest he died fighting, either killed by tank fire or in a close-quarters engagement with American infantry. A third version claims he took his own life rather than face capture. What is certain is that by the morning of October 17th, organized German resistance in Aachen had ceased. The city that Hitler had declared must be held to the last man had fallen to American forces after just 4 days of intense urban combat. The Battle of Aachen marked several important firsts in the European theater. It was the first German city to fall to Allied forces, breaking both a physical and psychological barrier. It demonstrated the effectiveness of American combined arms tactics in urban terrain, and perhaps most significantly, it showed that the fortress strategy Hitler had mandated for defending German cities was fundamentally flawed when faced with overwhelming American firepower and industrial capacity. The victory came at a considerable cost. The Americans suffered approximately 5,000 casualties during the Aachen campaign, including about 500 killed. German military casualties were similar, with the added tragedy of around 1,000 civilian deaths. The city itself was devastated, with an estimated 80% of buildings damaged or destroyed. For the American Sherman tank crews who had been at the forefront of the battle, Aachen provided valuable lessons that would be applied in subsequent urban operations. They learned to work in closer coordination with infantry, developed tactics for using buildings as cover, and gained confidence in their ability to operate in restricted terrain. The psychological impact of the tank's presence on enemy morale was also noted. German prisoners repeatedly mentioned the terrifying effect of Sherman tanks appearing suddenly around street corners or crashing through building walls. As American forces secured and began to administer the conquered city, they discovered the human cost of Hitler's hold at all costs doctrine. Civilians emerged from cellars and bomb shelters, many malnourished and traumatized. The Nazi propaganda about American atrocities was quickly exposed as false, as U.S. troops distributed food and medical aid to the population. Among those who witnessed the aftermath was Ernest Hemingway, working as a war correspondent. He wrote, "Aachen is a dead city. The only living things are American soldiers and a few old people who have crawled out of the wreckage. It gives you a strange feeling to walk through the streets of the first German city taken by American troops." For both sides, Aachen represented a turning point. The Americans had proven they could take a defended German city, setting the stage for the advance into the heart of the Reich. The Germans had learned that no amount of fanaticism could compensate for the material superiority of the Allied forces. The myth of the impregnable fortress city had been shattered by the relentless advance of Sherman tanks through the ancient streets. And somewhere in the rubble of Aachen, whether in an unmarked grave or a prisoner of war camp, was SS Sturmbannführer Heinrich Müller, a man who had witnessed firsthand the crushing of Hitler's fortress strategy by American armor and who had faced the ultimate moral crisis of a soldier ordered to fight beyond hope or reason. The fall of Aachen reverberated far beyond the ruined city itself. In Berlin, Hitler was furious. He had personally ordered that the city be held at all costs, declaring it a fortress that would demonstrate German resolve to defend the homeland. Its loss, after just 4 days of fighting, undermined the entire defensive strategy he had envisioned for protecting the Reich's borders. In the days immediately following the capture of the town hall, American forces conducted thorough clearing operations throughout Aachen. Isolated pockets of resistance remained, particularly in the extensive network of cellars and tunnels beneath the city. Some German stragglers, cut off during the battle and unaware of the city's fall, continued to fight until discovered by American patrols. Others, recognizing the futility of further resistance, surrendered when encountered. The Americans were surprised by what they found in some of these hidden locations. In one basement, troops from the 26th Infantry Regiment discovered a makeshift hospital, where a German doctor and 2 nurses had continued caring for wounded soldiers despite having no electricity, running water, or substantial medical supplies. The Americans evacuated these patients to their own medical facilities, where many survived wounds that would have been fatal without proper treatment. In another cellar, soldiers found a group of Hitler Youth members boys as young as 14, who had been armed with Panzerfausts and ordered to ambush American tanks. The boys surrendered without resistance, many breaking into tears when confronted by American GIs who, rather than executing them as their Nazi leaders had warned, gave them chocolate rations and evacuated them to safety. Perhaps the most poignant discoveries were the civilians who emerged from hiding places throughout the city. Many had spent the entire battle in cellars or improvised bunkers, subsisting on minimal food and water. Their first encounters with American troops were often tinged with terror, having been told that the Americans would rape, murder, and pillage. The reality, soldiers sharing rations and medics treating civilian injuries, created a profound cognitive dissonance for many Germans who had been subjected to years of Nazi propaganda. Maria Schmidt, the elderly woman whose diary provided one of the most complete civilian accounts of the battle, recorded her observations during these first days of American occupation. The Americans have set up a food distribution center in what remains of the school. They give us bread and canned meat, more food than I have seen in months. Some of the younger women still hide when the soldiers approach, but I have seen nothing to fear from them. They seem more interested in securing the city than bothering old women like me. For the American tank crews who had spearheaded the assault on Aachen, the aftermath of battle brought a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and grim satisfaction. The crews spent hours maintaining their vehicles, repairing battle damage, and restocking ammunition. Many tanks had been hit multiple times, but had survived due to lucky angles or non-penetrating strikes. The M4 Sherman, though maligned by some for its inadequacies against German heavy tanks like the Tiger, had proven well suited to urban combat with its reliability, maneuverability, and adequate firepower for destroying buildings and bunkers. Sergeant Frank Moyer, whose Ghost Sherman had penetrated deep behind German lines and caused havoc from the rear, became something of a legend among American troops. His tank, despite bearing the scars of multiple Panzerfaust hits that had failed to penetrate its armor, remained operational throughout the battle. Moyer was awarded the Silver Star for his actions, and his story was featured in Stars and Stripes, the U.S. Armed Forces newspaper, complete with a photograph of his Sherman with its distinctive ghost emblem hastily painted on its turret after the battle. "We just got lucky," Moyer told a correspondent, downplaying his achievement. "Right place, right time. The Germans didn't expect a tank to be there, so they ran instead of fighting. Any other Sherman crew would have done the same thing." Despite his modesty, Moyer's exploit demonstrated the psychological impact of armor in urban combat. The appearance of a tank where none should be able to reach could trigger panic and collapse among defenders already stretched to their breaking point. Colonel John Corley, who had commanded the northern attack on Aachen, used the battle as a case study in urban combat tactics. In a report to higher headquarters, he emphasized several lessons learned: the effectiveness of combined arms teams with infantry and tanks working closely together, the value of precise artillery fire in urban terrain, and the importance of isolating the battlefield by cutting off enemy reinforcements and supplies. These lessons would be applied in subsequent operations as American forces pushed deeper into Germany. For the ordinary American infantrymen who had fought alongside the tanks, the battle left lasting impressions. Private First Class William Bradley of the 26th Infantry Regiment later wrote in his memoir, "The tanks gave us courage. When you're moving through streets where every window might hide a sniper or a Panzerfaust team, having a Sherman rumbling alongside makes all the difference. They could blast a hole through a wall that might take us hours to breach otherwise. But we protected them too. Tank crews can't see everything, especially in a city. It was a partnership. This partnership between armor and infantry had not been perfected overnight. Early in the Normandy campaign, American tanks and infantry had sometimes operated independently, with poor coordination and resulting casualties. By the time of the Aachen battle, however, tank-infantry cooperation had evolved considerably. Radio communication between tank commanders and infantry platoon leaders had improved, and many units had developed informal signals to communicate in the chaos of battle. One such innovation was the placement of field telephones on the rear of some Sherman tanks, allowing infantry to speak directly to the tank commander without exposing themselves. Another was the practice of assigning specific infantry squads to protect specific tanks, creating bonds between the tankers and the doughs, as infantrymen were colloquially known, that transcended formal military structure. The human cost of the battle continued to mount even after fighting ceased. Unexploded ordnance claimed victims among civilians returning to check on their homes. Disease spread in the crowded cellars where many still sheltered. The task of recovering bodies from the rubble would continue for months, with the final death toll never precisely determined. American military government officers quickly established basic services in the conquered city. Engineers restored limited electricity and water supplies to critical facilities. Medical units treated civilians and prisoners alike. Military police maintained order and began the process of identifying Nazi party officials who would require denazification procedures. For the German prisoners, the aftermath of battle brought vastly different experiences depending on their status. Wehrmacht soldiers were generally processed efficiently and sent to POW camps in France or the United States, where most would remain until the war's end. Their treatment, while austere, was correct according to the Geneva Conventions. For SS members, the situation was more precarious. American hatred for the SS, fueled by knowledge of atrocities and the fanatical resistance they had encountered, sometimes led to harsh treatment. Some SS prisoners were segregated from other captives and subjected to intensive interrogation. Others were allegedly shot while attempting to escape, a euphemism that covered a multitude of battlefield executions. While such killings violated official policy, the chaos of combat and the emotional response to discovering concentration camps earlier in the campaign created an atmosphere where such violations sometimes occurred. The fate of SS Sturmbannführer Heinrich Müller remained a subject of uncertainty and conflicting reports. According to some accounts, he was killed during the breakout attempt from the town hall, his body subsequently buried in an unmarked grave, or simply lost in the rubble. Other sources suggested he was captured, but died of wounds while being transported to a rear area hospital. A third version claimed he successfully escaped the American encirclement and made his way to another German unit, only to be executed by his own side for abandoning his post. This uncertainty was typical of the fog of war that surrounded urban combat. The chaotic nature of fighting in a labyrinthine environment with forces fragmented into small units operating semi-independently meant that many individual stories were never fully documented. The focus of military record-keeping was on operational outcomes rather than personal narratives, leaving gaps that historians would struggle to fill decades later. For Hitler and the Nazi leadership, the fall of Aachen necessitated both practical and propaganda responses. Militarily, the failure of the fortress strategy called for a reassessment of how to defend German territory against the Allied advance. Rather than committing to static defense of cities, subsequent operations would see more mobile reserves positioned to counterattack Allied penetrations, a reversion to traditional German doctrine that had been abandoned in Hitler's no retreat orders. In terms of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels' ministry faced the challenge of explaining the loss of the first German city while maintaining the fiction that final victory remained possible. Their solution was to emphasize the sacrificial heroism of Aachen's defenders while claiming they had inflicted disproportionate casualties on the Americans. Nazi newspapers characterized the battle as a delaying action that had served its purpose by slowing the Allied advance and providing time for the construction of the vaunted West Wall, or Siegfried Line, defenses further east. In reality, the rapid fall of Aachen had shocked the German high command. The city had been expected to hold out for weeks, not days. The speed and power of the American attack, particularly the use of armored vehicles in what had been considered terrain unsuitable for tanks, forced a re-evaluation of defensive planning throughout the Western Front. One immediate consequence was increased emphasis on developing and deploying anti-tank weapons that could be used effectively in urban environments. Production of Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks was accelerated, and training programs for Volkssturm units increasingly focused on tank hunting tactics. The Germans also began converting more of their own tank production to assault guns and tank destroyers, which were better suited to defensive operations in restricted terrain than conventional tanks. For the civilians of Aachen, the days following the battle brought a complex mix of experiences. Relief at survival mingled with grief for lost loved ones and homes. Freedom from Nazi authority was offset by the humiliation of defeat and occupation. Many experienced a profound identity crisis as the ideology that had dominated German life for a decade was suddenly delegitimized. Maria Schmidt's diary entries from late October 1944 captured this ambivalence. Today I stood in line for American rations. The soldier who gave me bread smiled and called me Grandma. I almost wept, such kindness from an enemy. Yesterday, I helped Frau Weber bury her husband. He died when their cellar collapsed during the fighting. She blames both sides equally. I understand this feeling. The Americans faced their own challenges in administering the conquered city. Few soldiers spoke German, and even fewer civilians spoke English, creating a significant language barrier. Cultural misunderstandings abounded. American informality and directness sometimes came across as rudeness to Germans accustomed to more formal social interactions. Conversely, German reserve was often interpreted as arrogance or hostility by Americans. Despite these challenges, a functional working relationship gradually developed. The Americans needed the cooperation of the civilian population to manage the city effectively, and the Germans needed American resources to survive. Pragmatism on both sides overcame ideological barriers and began the long process of reconciliation that would eventually transform former enemies into allies. The impact of Aachen extended far beyond its immediate tactical significance. As the first major German city to fall to Allied forces, it represented a psychological milestone in the campaign. The Nazi propaganda myth of invincibility on German soil had been shattered, and with it, some of the fanatical resistance that had been expected from the civilian population. The battle also provided important lessons for subsequent urban operations. The Americans learned that urban combat required specialized training and equipment, with a premium on close coordination between different arms. The Germans learned that static defense was vulnerable to American material superiority, and that more mobile, flexible approaches were needed. For military planners studying the battle afterward, several factors emerged as decisive in the American victory. First was the effectiveness of preliminary isolation, cutting the city off from reinforcement before beginning the main assault. Second was the overwhelming firepower advantage provided by artillery and air support. Third was the innovative use of armor in what had traditionally been considered infantry terrain. The Sherman tank, in particular, emerged from Aachen with an enhanced reputation for urban combat. While its limitations against German heavy tanks in open terrain had been painfully demonstrated in earlier campaigns, the streets of Aachen played to the Sherman's strengths: reliability, maneuverability, and adequate firepower for reducing buildings and strong points. Tank crews developed numerous improvised techniques for urban fighting. Some welded steel bars across the front of their vehicles to detonate magnetic mines before they could attach to the hull. Others mounted additional machine guns for better coverage against infantry attacks from multiple directions. Some even attached telephones to the rear of their tanks so accompanying infantry could communicate directly with the crew inside. The battle also highlighted the importance of specialized engineering vehicles. Sherman dozers, equipped with large bulldozer blades, proved invaluable for clearing rubble and obstacles. Flamethrower tanks were effective against buildings where defenders refused to surrender. Recovery vehicles worked constantly to retrieve damaged tanks that might otherwise have been abandoned in the narrow streets. In the weeks following the battle, as American forces consolidated their hold on Aachen and prepared for further advances, engineers and intelligence officers conducted detailed studies of German defenses. They found that while some positions had been prepared with professional military expertise, others showed signs of hasty, inadequate construction, evidence of the mixed quality of the defending force and the shortage of time and resources faced by the German command. One discovery that particularly interested American intelligence was documentation of the German civilian evacuation plan. Prior to the battle, Nazi authorities had attempted to evacuate all civilians from Aachen, particularly women, children, and the elderly. Those who refused to leave were threatened with execution for undermining the defense effort. Despite these threats, thousands had remained, either out of attachment to their homes or inability to travel. The Nazi approach to civilian evacuation contrasted sharply with their treatment of foreign laborers in the city. Thousands of forced workers from occupied territories had been working in factories around Aachen. As American forces approached, these workers were marched eastward under guard, with many dying from exhaustion or being shot when unable to continue. Evidence of these atrocities, discovered by American troops, reinforced their determination to defeat the Nazi regime completely. By early November 1944, Aachen had transformed from a battleground to a forward base for further American operations. Supply depots, field hospitals, and vehicle repair facilities were established in the less damaged sections of the city. The historic significance of being the first German city captured by Allied forces made Aachen a frequent stop for visiting dignitaries, war correspondents, and military observers studying urban combat techniques. For the Sherman tank crews that had led the assault, there was little time to rest on their laurels. The campaign continued with new objectives to be taken and new German defenses to overcome. Many of these same tanks and crews would go on to participate in the Battle of the Bulge, the Rhineland campaign, and the final advance into the German heartland. The legacy of Aachen would be remembered differently by different participants. For Americans, it represented a validation of their industrial might and tactical adaptability, the ability to project overwhelming force and adjust techniques to new challenges. For Germans, it marked the beginning of the final painful phase of the war, when defeat became increasingly inevitable and the fighting moved onto home soil. The battle would be studied at military academies for decades to come as an example of successful urban operations. Its lessons influenced Cold War planning for potential battles in European cities and continued to shape military thinking about urban warfare into the 21st century. The coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air power demonstrated at Aachen became a template for subsequent operations in built-up areas. For the city itself, October 1944 marked the end of one historical era and the beginning of another. Aachen, the ancient capital of Charlemagne's empire and the coronation site of Holy Roman Emperors for centuries, had survived countless wars throughout its long history. It would survive this one too, eventually rebuilding from the rubble to become a prosperous modern German city and a symbol of European integration, ironically fulfilling Hitler's vision of Aachen as a symbol of German connection to European history, but in a context of peace rather than conquest. The human stories of the battle, Muller's moral crisis, Moyer's daring tank exploit, Maria Schmidt's civilian perspective, illustrate the complex reality behind the strategic calculations and tactical maneuvers. Urban combat is ultimately about people fighting in the most intimate and desperate circumstances, making decisions under extreme pressure that can determine the fate of many others. In the decades following the war, historians would debate various aspects of the Battle of Aachen. Some questioned whether the city could have been bypassed rather than assaulted directly, potentially saving lives and preserving historic structures. Others argued about the necessity of the heavy artillery bombardment that damaged so much of the ancient city. Military analysts debated the effectiveness of Hitler's fortress strategy and whether a more mobile defense might have prolonged German resistance. What remains undisputed is that Aachen represented a critical psychological milestone in the campaign to defeat Nazi Germany. The conquest of the first German city demonstrated that the Third Reich was not invulnerable on its own soil and that the vaunted defenses of the Reich could be overcome by American industrial might and tactical skill. For the Sherman tank crews who had navigated the narrow streets under constant threat from ambushes, the battle vindicated their training and equipment despite the tank's known limitations. The M4 Sherman was never the best tank of the war in terms of armor or firepower, but at Aachen it proved to be the right tank in the right place at the right time, mobile enough for urban streets, reliable enough for sustained operations, and available in sufficient numbers to overwhelm the defenders. By December 1944, Aachen had largely faded from headlines as attention shifted to newer battles along the advancing front. The city settled into its role as an American rear area, with military police patrolling streets, civil affairs officers working to restore basic services, and engineers clearing rubble to make way for military traffic. The cathedral, miraculously spared from major damage despite its proximity to heavy fighting, became a symbol of survival and continuity amidst destruction. For surviving civilians like Maria Schmidt, daily life developed new routines under American occupation. Her diary entries from this period describe long lines for food and other necessities, the challenges of living in damaged buildings with limited utilities, and the gradual emergence of a black market economy. She also notes the changing relationship between occupiers and occupied. The young American soldiers no longer stare at us with suspicion. Some try to speak German words, mostly incorrect, but we appreciate the effort. Yesterday one gave candy to Frau Weber's grandchild. Small kindnesses matter in such times. The SS Sturmbannführer Heinrich Müller, whether he died in the battle or survived as a prisoner, represented a type that would soon fade from history. The committed Nazi true believer whose worldview collapsed along with the Reich he served. Thousands like him had enforced Hitler's will across Europe, combining military skill with ideological fervor. Their defeat at places like Aachen was essential to ending the Nazi nightmare. Sergeant Frank Moyer and his Ghost Sherman crew exemplified a different type, the practical, adaptable American fighters whose approach to war was less ideological and more problem-solving. Faced with an unexpected opportunity behind enemy lines, they improvised a solution that maximized impact while minimizing risk. This pragmatism, multiplied across millions of Allied servicemen, proved more than a match for Nazi fanaticism. Colonel John Corley, the tactical commander who adjusted his approach mid-battle to focus tank infantry teams on specific breakthrough points, demonstrated the American military's increasing sophistication as the war progressed. Early American operations had sometimes been characterized by rigidity and doctrinal limitations. By late 1944, commanders like Corley had learned to adapt quickly to battlefield realities, creating effective solutions to novel problems. The battle's aftermath also illustrated the beginning of America's transition from wartime to occupation mindset. Military government officers who took control of Aachen after its capture were implementing policies designed not just to manage a conquered enemy, but to lay groundwork for eventual democratic reconstruction. The denazification process began immediately, with Nazi officials identified and removed from positions of influence, while non-Nazi technical experts were retained to help restore essential services. For Germany as a whole, the fall of Aachen presaged the collapse of the Western defenses and the eventual Allied advance to the Rhine and beyond. Hitler's response to the setback, doubling down on his no-retreat orders and planning the Ardennes offensive, Battle of the Bulge, demonstrated his increasing detachment from military reality. The resources expended on that final major offensive might have extended German resistance if used for a more realistic defensive strategy. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, Aachen had already begun the long process of reconstruction. Some residents had returned to salvage what they could from damaged homes. Limited commercial activity resumed. Children played in the rubble, finding adventure in the destruction adults saw only as tragedy. Life continued, as it always does, adapting to new circumstances and finding paths forward through devastation. The final historical significance of Aachen perhaps lies not in the tactical details of its capture, but in what it represented, the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, the demonstration that no defense could ultimately withstand the combined might of the Allied powers, and the first step in Germany's long journey from defeat to rehabilitation and eventual integration into a peaceful European community. For the Sherman tank crews who had spearheaded the assault, Aachen provided validation of their role on the modern battlefield. Despite criticism of the Sherman's inadequacies against German heavy tanks, urban combat demonstrated that firepower was not the only relevant metric of effectiveness. Reliability, maintainability, and availability in numbers proved equally important in the confined streets of a defended city. The psychological impact of tanks on urban defenders, dramatically demonstrated by Moyer's Ghost Sherman, creating panic behind German lines, would influence military thinking about urban operations for generations. The lesson that a single armored vehicle in an unexpected location could have effects far beyond its actual combat power informed both tactics and equipment development in subsequent decades. As the European war ground toward its conclusion in the spring of 1945, the patterns established at Aachen would be repeated in city after city across Germany. The Americans had proven they could take defended urban areas through a combination of isolation, overwhelming firepower, and coordinated infantry tank operations. The Germans had learned that static defense, even with fanatical determination, could not compensate for material disadvantage. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Aachen had already been under American control for over 6 months. Its citizens had begun the long process of coming to terms with defeat, occupation, and the moral reckoning of the Nazi period. The city that had once been deemed a fortress to be held at all costs had instead become one of the first examples of post-Nazi German reconstruction. Today, visitors to modern Aachen would find few obvious traces of the desperate battle fought there in October 1944. The city has been rebuilt, its ancient cathedral restored, its streets busy with the commerce and daily life of a prosperous European city. But beneath the surface, in archives and memories, in military studies and historical analyses, the battle remains significant. A turning point when the war came home to Germany, when American tanks crushed the myth of the impregnable fortress, and when the Nazi dream of a 1,000-year Reich began its final, inevitable collapse.